I did my book report on Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, presented by me. About Daphne du Maurier. She was born in London, England, to Sir Gerald du Maurier and Muriel Beaumont on May 13th, 1907. She had two other sisters. Her dad worked as an actor/manager, and her mom was also an actress. Her grandpa was also a writer for a magazine called Punch. Her uncle was a main columnist for a different magazine. All these different connections helped du Maurier get an agent for her literary career. During her school years, she attended public schools in London, Paris, and Meudon, France, which is a city in France. It's not a country, or whatever, yeah. Okay, about the author continued. She received the Grand Master Award from the Mystery Writers of America. There is also an award named after her given for excellence in mystery and suspense. She died on April 19th, 1989. She also wrote the books The Birds and The Scapegoat. She must have liked animals. About Rebecca, which is the book. This book has 410 pages. It was published by a random dude named Victor Gollancz in 1938. It was written in first person. The narrator is the main character, Mrs. De Winter. Its approximate age or skill level is probably freshman, 9th grade and up. It was actually written in the early 1930s. And this is a copy of the book, which you can't see. There we go. Focused. Focused. Doesn't look like a book a guy would read, but I did. Next slide. The setting. This book takes place at Mrs. Van Hopper's hotel at first, but then moves to Cornwall, England in a mansion called Manderley, which Mr. De Winter actually owns. What was going on when this book was written? I'm glad you asked. During the 1930s in England, there was a Great Depression that took place in the whole world, including the United States. At this time, Hitler was rising, and it was just a few years before 1939 when World War II started in Europe. Unemployment had increased from 1 million in the 1920s to 2.5 million in the 1930s in England alone. Cars were also becoming more of a necessity. The number of cars on the road doubled in the 1930s. Next slide. The main characters. The main characters are Mrs. De Winter. She's the protagonist. She marries Mr. De Winter, but for most of the book is depressed because she feels like he doesn't love her. But often, she actually goes on walks with him, and she's always happy with him at that moment, but then they always get separated again, he's off with business, and she gets depressed again. So yeah, Mr. De Winter, Mrs. De Winter's husband, obviously, and he moved on quickly to Mrs. De Winter after Rebecca, but he knows a secret about Rebecca that Mrs. De Winter doesn't know for most of the book. Suspense. Main characters continued. Mrs. Danvers is a crazy housewife. She absolutely adored Rebecca, and doesn't want anyone to take her spot. For the whole book, she constantly shows actions that show her hatred towards a new Mrs. De Winter. She is not a nice lady. She's more of a servant for the mansion, but I just called her housewife because it fit her personality. Bertrice, a friend of Mr. De Winter, and she's very nice to both the De Winters and gives great advice sometimes to Mrs. De Winter. Giles is another friend of the De Winters. He doesn't make too big of a difference in the story. So, I probably shouldn't have put him on main characters. Okay, Frank, a servant or worker at the Manderley Mansion, he always has Mr. De Winter's back. He's a good guy. In the end of the book, it actually is like it gets better, a lot better. So the main characters that show up later in the book is Colonel Julian, and he's the colonel in charge of the harbor outside the Manderley Mansion. He makes a big difference at the end of the book. Fable is definitely the antagonist. He hates Mr. De Winter and claims that he and Rebecca were lovers when she died. What a jerk. Baker is a guy that Rebecca went to for a secret reason. He tells everyone an unbelievable fact towards the end of the book. Rebecca. Just kidding, she's dead. But her memory does haunt Mrs. De Winter a lot. The summary of Rebecca. The book starts out with the narrator, the soon-to-be Mrs. De Winter. She just never mentions her first name. She's working as a servant to a wealthy woman named Mrs. Van Hopper. She always is having social meetings with people, and the narrator doesn't pay much attention to them until a man named Mr. De Winter comes along. Sounds like Romeo and Juliet. They hit it off and eventually planned to get married, just in time because Mrs. Van Hopper was about to take the narrator with her to America. Mr. De Winter then carries her off to a mansion in Cornwall, England called Manderley. Little does she know she's now living in the shadow of his late wife, Rebecca. She's frowned upon by many of the servants at first, especially a housewife named Mrs. Danvers, who's made a shrine for Rebecca in a room at Mr. De Winter's mansion. She loved Rebecca. Months pass, and Mrs. De Winter feels that her husband is depressed a lot and doesn't truly love her, because he still loves Rebecca. Then, there's a shipwreck on the harbor by Manderley, and a very interesting surprise shows up, and it transforms the ending completely with the entrance of 3 new characters. Suspenseful! Whee! Alright, next slide. Ways I relate to a character. I somewhat relate to Miss Danvers. Don't get me wrong. Even though she's a crazy housewife, I relate to her because she finds it very hard to move on to another person after she absolutely adored another. It's the same for me in a way, because I'm used to being like a set-in-stone kind of guy of living, and it started to change my life drastically for me at the blink of an eye, just like it was with Miss Danvers when Rebecca died. Symbolism I found in the book. At the end of the ball that the De Winters throw in their mansion, fireworks light up the night sky, and then disappear just as fast. It represents the way that Mrs. De Winter can be entirely filled with happiness at one point, and then be depressed again due to Mr. De Winter supposedly not loving her. The impact of the novel on world. This novel has a major impact on the world because it was named for one of the best mystery suspense novels of the century. It showed everyone that, if you know the ending, when things feel grim and impossible to make up for, everything will turn out alright in the end. Maybe not everything, but it'll be good. Lessons or themes in the book. Don't base everything about someone on how they act on the outside. On the inside, there may be something that makes you feel better about everything. This represents Mrs. De Winter wondering why Maxim is always depressed. And then he realizes the truth at the end that is beyond her comprehension. Comprehension. Would I recommend this romance/mystery/suspense novel? I actually would definitely recommend this book if you're willing to trudge through 300 pages to get to the interesting part. The whole body of the book rambles on about how Mrs. De Winter is feeling apart from Maxim. After she finds out the truth behind Rebecca, though, the ending is amazing. I literally, drove through the last 120 pages out of the 410 that were in it. The end.